In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on excuses, concerned with the just cause underlying distinct issues arising with perceived misconduct and or actual factual judging as to the, be it in the case one may not provide excuse, misconduct includes some misconducts inappropriate to satisfy internal and or external conditions in relation to well-defined situations and or wrongdoing onto another, amongst, in the most severe cases, with the disproportionate conduct within the innateness of the misconduct, troublemaking, allowances for the uniquely existing conducts to be excused, be it the conducts are conducts, never misconducts, and or may exist appropriate to the mind-body connections of the individual excusing the conduct, meaning the conducts are in relation to the wrongdoing and or troublemaking excused in relation to specific brainstormed evaluation schemas. One can evaluate the truthfulness amongst the workability to the distinct meaningful criteria, be it each criteria only concerned with the satisfying of some most meaningful, truly actual factual, instead of merely perceived to mean some analytical term, combinative of the analytical key points, combinative of existing prior some just facts to justify just cause within excuse, allowances for the excuse of excusing to the exclusion of one's conducts, exclusively to the exclusion of distinct misconducts and or arbitrary and or meaningless criterion, be it communicated by the individual wronged, often with petty truth claims lacking in truthfulness to constitute a meaningful truth claim and therefore be invalid within its truth claim, excuses the perceived wrongdoing and or perceived inappropriate conduct amongst misconduct in relation to the actuality, factuality existing conducts appropriate are excused in relation to meaningful excuses, as to constitute certain excuses one means in relation to communicate soundness clearly to the communications, effectively and efficiently excusing with increasing and optimizing the effectivenesses and or efficiencies within one's clear communications, well-defined communication concerning the meaningful communications, to communicate the clearest, never vague meanings one means within excusing one's conduct rationally, to mean one can and or may only excuse conduct in relation to providing excuse to exclude the disproportionality, undue, had one not and or in contrast or in comparison to the other individual engaged in conducts more proportionate to the positive outcomes of one and or the other individuals whom is of most concern, subjective well-being from moment to moment in relation to unnecessary suffering and or unnecessary psychological distress inflicted arbitrarily and or meaninglessly and or pointlessly and or to the most aimless absurdities existing within the mind-body connections of the other, inflicted wrongfully, unduly, unjustly by the misconducts. The conducts exist as misconducts, not as conducts meaningful to excuse in relation to proportionate judgment. One may provide explanation excusing conducts in relation to the underlying values. One clearly communicates proportionate, never disproportionate, as to constitute the only some existing underlying meaningfulness criteria to satisfy the good enough conditions within the as must be good enough and necessarily necessary conditions to excuse misconducts internally and or externally valid and or psychologically true with internal and or external validity validated in relation to the satisfying of the ultimate psychological truths of existence to excuse the misconduct perceived yet conduct existing, to mean that the perception of misconduct does not mean the conduct is a misconduct and or inappropriate, nor is it disproportionate. Only the proportionality within the excuse and or meaningfulness rational beyond one's rational to mean surpassed a rational expectation, allowances for meaningfulness within the excuse to be inferred, exceeding one's expectations of proportionate judgment in relation to the disproportionality inflicted in relation to inappropriateness, unethical conducts amongst the conducts, actualities, factualities, probabilistically exist in relation to inferring the appropriateness in relation to excusing conducts proportionate to one's underlying values and or ability to satisfy one's own some certain underlying psychological needs to the minimum inflicted negative experiences of subjective well-being and or meaning in life, unnecessary suffering and or unnecessary psychological distress does not constitute just cause, as meaning the harm inflicted and or threat inflicted and or injury inflicted is proportional to the conducts and or the unnecessary suffering and or unnecessary psychological distress inflicted, be it inflicted that some may be tolerated in the cases in which that the disproportionate conducts of the other outweighs the excuses for one engaging in conducts and or misconducts excused as misconducts to be conducts in relation to the truer disproportionate misconducts of the complainant, meaning that excuses are justified in relation to the always existing some proportionality, the total sum costs and expenditures are proportionate in contrast to the disproportionate total sum costs and damages inflicted by the complainant and or satisfy the meaningful criteria to constitute internal and or external validity as to the excuse working within the justifications one excuses conducts meaningful surpassed a rational expectation to satisfy the meaningfulness criteria most distinct in relation to the juster, fairer facts to support one's excuse and excuse conducts. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keep looking those up for that.